Thank you, Eyal and Alona. I'm here today with Stephen Engelberg. Steve has been editor-in-chief of ProPublica since 2013. He was also the founding managing editor of that before, and has spent the past year as the chair of the Pulitzer Prize board. He spent 9 years on that board. Before being at ProPublica, Steve was the managing editor of the Oregonian, and before that, he spent 18 years at the New York Times, where he founded the investigative unit and where the work that he oversaw won a lot of prizes, including the Pulitzer in more than one occasion. We worked together at the Times in those years, and we have been personal friends for 25 years. Steve, welcome. Thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
Steve, you were, as I said, part of the launching of ProPublica. This was a whole new concept when it began, and Shomarim is modeled partly on it in the sense of a kind of independent approach to pushing, increasing the amount of investigative journalism in a society which was starting to fall, it was beginning to fall away. So tell us a little bit about how what you do differs from other newsrooms and, you know, maybe a lesson or two along the way that Shomarim might learn.
Well, first of all, I mean, I think nonprofit journalism as we do it, fortunately, is very similar to the ordinary journalism that we all grew up in. You know, the standards are the same. We have, you know, intense fact checking. We have not one, but two in-house lawyers reviewing all of our work. So in a sense, when you and I worked at the New York Times and did investigative reporting together, the work we do is very similar, done in some cases by some of the same people we used to work with. So in that sense, there's very little difference. Where we differ a little bit, and I don't know whether Shomarim has this sense or not, it's worked well for us, is that our founding donor, we were very fortunate to have a very wealthy couple, Herb and Marion Sandler, provide the initial money for this, had a sense that what the organization needed to point toward was not beautifully written feature stories or even awards, although we're happy to have won a few, as you mentioned, but impact. Impact is the sort of guiding light of what we think about when we organize our work. You know, how do you have so many stories you could do in any place, and as someone who follows Israel not quite as closely as you, but still closely, I could see that there's almost an infinite number of possibilities of stories to do literally every single day. You know, just this morning, an Iranian nuclear facility seems to have had an accident. How interesting. So one could be investigative in Israel, I think, infinitely. Where we point ourselves, and I think this has been valuable, is toward impact. Where can we do journalism that makes a difference? So the one thing that is different from my previous jobs is if I have a list of 10 stories, I try to choose the ones we might do where we could actually make a difference.
That's actually really interesting. I want to ask you to go down a little deeper on how you define impact.
Well, we're very clear on it, actually. It's interesting. We publish a quarterly report. We make it public, put it on the internet so that people who, that sort of keeps us honest, so to say. We're not claiming this just to donors and secret meetings. This is something that we publicly proclaim. So we're very conservative in what we define as impact. But impact is something substantive. I mean, journalists like to say when we feel a little depressed that our stories aren't making enough difference, well, at least we added something to the conversation. That to us is not impact. Impact is a law was changed, a man who was in jail was freed. And in the case of our coverage of the far-right neo-Nazi movements, literally a number of people who we identified as having participated in violence at Charlottesville back in the famous Unite the Right rally in 2017, as a result of our reporting, were indicted and sent to prison. So that is impact. It's a high bar. You don't need it in every story. But we are aiming for real world effects. And so that, you know, that changes your story choice. You're not going to do a story and say, well, here's something we're doing that's just really sad. And you should read the story and at the end of it feel that the world is a terrible place. We want you to read the story and get to the end of it and say, okay, if I were going to write a letter right now to the person who's accountable for this, I know who to send it to, I know who's accountable, and I know what my letter is going to say, which is, why don't you guys try it a better way? And so that is where we start. That is the beginning of a ProPublica investigation.
That's super interesting. And are there occasions, so you mentioned the far right and the neo-Nazi work, which has been stellar, and I know there was also an incredible amount of work on doctors and things. We can talk about some of the better examples of what I'm curious whether there has ever been a misinterpretation of the kind of impact you expected. In other words, you thought that the point of your story was X and somehow Y occurred.
You know, it's interesting. I have not had that experience so much here. I definitely had that experience in my previous life. I would say that the more common thing, because impact is very hard to predict, and so you know, sometimes you just do stories because they have to be done. You don't expect immediate impact. You know, we did very early in our time a statistical analysis of the now famous presidential pardon process. You know, in America, the president of the United States has the unlimited power to pardon people who have committed crimes. And so we looked at who was getting pardons, and we tried to do a statistical analysis, and we concluded that basically, if you were a white person in America, you had about a 4 times better chance of getting a pardon than a black person who committed exactly the same crime. It's very complex how you do these statistics, but we published this story during the Obama administration. We had an African-American president, an African-American first lady, and an African-American attorney general who was running the pardon process. Sure. So we thought that everything would change the next morning. And not only did that not happen, it never changed at all. And it was politics. They didn't want to be perceived as doing anything that, quote, helped black criminals, quote, unquote. And so that, to me, remains one of the most stunningly unimpactful stories we've ever done. And it seemed like such a no-brainer. How could it be easier than this? So, you know, I would say the more common thing is, you know, you look at something and you think this is going to work, and it doesn't. And then other times you think, well, I doubt anything will happen here, and the world goes crazy.
And can you think of a good example of that second?
Absolutely. We had a reporter come to us from the New York Daily News, and she wanted to write about the fact that the New York Police Department was in some cases sort of throwing people out of their apartments. They would say, we think you're dealing drugs, and so you have to leave your apartment. And these were mostly poor people, and the allegations were not things that were proven in court. They could come from police informants. And in some of these cases, it was pretty clear they had the wrong person, you know, and it wasn't right. And they were throwing people out of their apartments. Some of these people became homeless. So I thought it was a very good story. I liked it a lot. And the Daily News wasn't as enthusiastic about it as we were. So we said, well, we'll handle all the statistical stuff, and we'll work with the reporter. And we published what I thought was a very nice story. And New York City went crazy. The city council passed 12 bills to fix this, and like banned it. And then we won the Pulitzer Prize with the New York Daily News for public service, which is the biggest award you can win. Yes. I would never in a million years have assumed that we would either have that impact or that kind of public acclaim for that particular story. But, you know, looking back on it, it was a perfect kind of ProPublica story, because we identified a problem. We used statistics and sort of, you know, more than anecdotes to prove it. And for some reason, the politicians were really irate about it and changed the whole thing. So, you know, people say all the time to us, you know, in the current environment, don't you want to give up on all of this? Because, you know, there are people who believe one thing and there are people who believe another, and you'll never persuade anybody of anything. There's certainly some truth in that, but I also would say, surprisingly, if you really bring the receipts, as we say in English, you know, the actual proof, you can change people's minds. Not always, not, you know, inevitably, but more than you might think.
That's actually super interesting. So you're mentioning this particular series with the Daily News makes me also want to ask you a little more about this model that ProPublica launched and that Shomarim, to some extent, is seeking to follow, which is to not always, but often team up with another news organization. So talk a little bit about when you first started doing this and whether it was met with open arms or not, because I think Shomarim also has, you know, a mixed reception to this idea of, hi, we have something free for you. Yeah, sure, kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, and you mentioned that I was the founding managing editor. The founding editor of ProPublica was Paul Steiger, who was leading a number of years, very successful years, as the editor of the American paper, the Wall Street Journal. And it was his notion that we could come to major media outlets with investigative reporting, and that they would be willing to publish it if it was offered for free. I was very skeptical of that. You know, I left the New York Times in the early 2000s, and during that period, the New York Times attitude toward partnerships was, we are the greatest newspaper in the world. Why do we need your dreck? You know, I mean, what's the point? You know, we can do everything ourselves. And we, like Shomarim, I think, were met in the early years with some mixed responses. One of the things that happened was that we were able to prove ourselves. Some of the early stories we did, I think, and this was deliberate, were quite good. So that people said, oh, well, if that's what you're going to do, that's a whole different thing. We like some of that. You know, a second thing is that the economics became very difficult. And the whole economic model began to shift. And so today, I would argue that for an internet publication, your number one driver of your money, your revenue, is subscriptions. Well, how do you get people to subscribe? Well, one of the great ways is to publish stories that are so exciting and so exclusive, so unique to your organization, that people will give you money every month. And so suddenly there became this very large premium on exclusive content. And lo and behold, not only were we creating it, but we were giving it to people for free. And so that then, I think, shifted the conversation. And it has continued to be favorable. I think, I would assume, I hope, the dream of Shomarim over time is to get where we have gotten to, which is at this point, we are now well known enough in the United States, and the internet is sufficiently capacious in terms of being able to sort of, take a great story and spread it around, that we don't, partnership is not a requirement for us. There are times where it makes an enormous amount of sense and we still do it. But this is something that we don't have to do. So if we
That's
have
very interesting. And I mean, in a way, it's funny because in a way, your successful partnerships in the early years probably made it easier to find partners and also less necessary.
That is exactly right. I mean, our goal from the beginning was to build a credible publishing platform. We knew that the partnership model would get us closer, right? Because, you start on day one, your web traffic is exactly zero. Yeah. And, there's so many choices on the internet that until you can sort of build a social media presence, and that is done essentially by circulating stories that have your name and your links on it, you don't have any traffic of your own. But hopefully over time, you use all the various levers and tricks of social media to get yourself an established audience who maybe doesn't come to you every day like a destination website, but when something big happens, you send them an email through an email subscription or a tweet or an alert, and you hope to sort of have them come to you when you have some.
Now, let me ask you about another complicated and interesting parallel between the United States and Israel, which is that one of the things of the last 4 years until the Biden administration came in is that the arrival of the Trump administration was both a threat and an enormous opportunity for investigative journalism. And in the same way, there's the head of government in Israel for the last many years has been someone who is populist and who also challenges the press openly. And so I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the challenge of covering such, in our case, president, in the case of Israel, prime minister, which is someone, so the idea is that there's a political side that you want to be careful not to fall into, at the same time, not to allow untruths and inappropriate challenges to democracy to go forward unchallenged. So talk a little bit about that difficulty and challenge that you guys faced, because it was a very important period for ProPublica these 4 years.
Yes, I mean, first of all, I should say, and Trump does say this, he's never deigned to mention us in this regard, but it's absolutely true. On the day that he was elected, our budget for the year 2017 was 16 million. This year, after 4 years of Trump, it's 36 million. So clearly our contributions have benefited from having this guy in the White House. So there's no question about that. I think there are a number of things that one has to be careful of. It is easy when somebody is calling you constantly the enemy of the people to become emotionally engaged in that, and to look at everything that this person says or does as a lie, to take a different view. And I think what has been very important for us is to continue to follow the evidence, and frankly, to present the evidence. We have tried not to get into these, back and forth arguments with the administration, but rather to say, let's stop arguing and let's start counting numbers here. Let's look at actual, again, as I mentioned earlier, receipts. One of our most famous stories under Trump was a piece about the policy they had on the U.S.-Mexico border of separating children from their family. When the family would arrive, they would put the child in a place without his mother or father in a sort of a chaotic, setting. Well, we had a source who went into one of these places and made a clandestine tape recording of what this sounded like. And you could hear clearly this little girl repeating over and over again that she wanted her mother and that she had the phone number of a relative in the United States, and here was the number, and, oh, please help me. And this was such a stunning revelation when we published it that the administration was forced to stop the policy. So we didn't argue about, immigration, good or bad. We said, this is what's happening, and here's the receipt. Here's the actual sound of a little child being separated and the suffering that they're undergoing. We had some, pediatricians listening to this. This is clearly a child in distress. And amazingly, our reporter was able to, the kid had remembered almost correctly the phone number. So we had all the digits except one. So we took that phone number and just kept guessing and eventually found the right person, found the relative, was able to tell the entire story. And that was really one of the most powerful, and that was impact,
That was an extraordinary piece. That was the Ginger Thompson piece, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, the brilliant piece, absolutely. But it's a good example of keeping your eye on the ball of the work and not focusing on the man himself.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of opinion on the internet. So our goal is not to add more opinion. We try really hard not to put that in our writing. We feel like plenty of other people have opinions, and they can take our work and say what they want. But we try to sort of stick to the facts.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm wondering though whether some of the contributions and some of the support that you've received have been sort of openly anti-Trump, and how you handle that, right? It's important for you to say, we're not here to do anything about who's president, but to promote the things that we care about, right?
Yes, I had an interesting experience because we have for the last couple of years written a weekly column to our subscribers, some of our donors. If you give us $5, we'll send you an email. I don't know whether that's a plus or a minus, but there you go. And so originally the president of ProPublica wrote it. Now I've been writing it. And one of the things that I wrote shortly after Biden's election was confirmed is I said, look, dear ProPublica readers, we've been investigating Trump for 4 years. We're now going to be investigating Biden with equal vigor. And I have no doubt whatsoever that mistakes will be made by this administration. As I'm a Washington trained correspondent. I started with Reagan. I've covered them all as either an editor or reporter. They will all make terrible mistakes. I was the lead reporter on Iran-Contra during the Republican years, so we know that amazing things can happen no matter who's president. And I said, we're going to cover those things. And I got a handful, I wouldn't say thousands, but I got several dozen people saying, why are you doing this? I thought you were on our side.
Yeah, perfect.
And I wrote back and I said, well, we're not actually on your side. We're not on anybody's side. And I think it's crucial, even if we lose donors, and we probably will, that we write tough stories about who's in the White House. Most of our existence, on a percentage basis, 8 years of our existence with the Obama administration, we were very tough on them.
Yes, no, I think it's a very important point you're making, and I think it's important also in Israel, because especially in Israel, it has become so associated with pro or anti-Netanyahu that to sort of stay focused on what we do is even harder.
Yes,
that's very, very important. Steve, I want to ask you also for a minute or two about the Pulitzers, because it's it's a magical name and a vital brand, and you've been part of the steward of that brand for these last 9 years. So talk a little bit about that too, how it functions, and if it's changed in any way in the years that you've been watching and participating.
Sure. Well, it is a prize that is very valued by American journalists. It's probably still the preeminent one. It has changed in the sort of 8 or 9 years now that I've been associated with it in some significant ways. I mean, Joseph Pulitzer was a famous American owner of newspapers. And, Not so long ago, the only people who could compete for a Pulitzer Prize were people who published stories in newspapers. And then they said, well, things are changing. Maybe websites could compete. And so that was opened the door, frankly, to ProPublica, among others, being a possible award winner. And we were the first internet news site to win a Pulitzer. In the years since then, we've opened it to magazines because it seemed to make no sense at all that you said the website of the New York Times is qualified, but the website of the New Yorker magazine was not. So magazines now compete in every category and have won a number of Pulitzer Prizes. Last year, we began for the first time a special category for audio. So we now have podcasts and radio programs that appear. And so step by step, I think we are trying to bring the Pulitzer Prizes into the 21st century in the sense that we all know that media is created and consumed, in all possible ways. The New York Times makes movies, it makes podcasts, it produces text, it runs photography. There's no distinction here. And so my hope that my successors in the board as I leave will continue this process, and it ultimately goes to the best journalism. In whatever form it is.
Yeah, that's interesting. And do you feel that in these 4 years and the Trump years, did you feel the kind of political pressure on the Pulitzers we were talking about a minute ago?
There is pressure almost every single year from various groups. We get letters and petitions and so on. There are a group of people who believe that this is a famous story about the New York Times winning a Pulitzer in the early 1930s for coverage of basically Stalin. Sure. And that the reporter basically got an interview with Stalin by ignoring the famine in the Ukraine. And I think there's pretty good evidence that this happened. The Times has long ago disavowed this. We get letters every year from Ukrainians saying, when are you going to take away this prize? And the board has looked at it repeatedly and decided not to for various complicated reasons. We hear from the Armenians about things relating to the Turkish genocide. I mean, I think increasingly people feel that this is another way to bring pressure on established, parts of our cultural landscape. And sure, I mean, people are constantly saying, investigate this and investigate that. I have to say, so far, we actually have hired people, independent former journalists to do these investigations, and so far, none of the charges have held up, but I don't rule out the possibility that someday somebody will complain about something and it will turn out to be true.
Yes, of course. Now, another thing I want to ask you about that ProPublica has undertaken in recent years is a local journalism initiative. And this is relevant for lots of reasons that I want you to talk about. But one thing is that, for example, in Israel, historically, journalism is focused on the big questions, right? Politics, national security, and those who are focused on PTSD or healthcare or education or crime have been historically seen as sort of lesser level of journalism. And I think that Israel has now become a much wealthier, more advanced society in which all of these issues, in fact, are quite vital and right. Tell you a lot. So I think that to some extent, your local journalism issue is related to that as money fell away from local journalism, you guys stepped in. So talk a little about the reason and the actual project.
Yeah, I mean, America being, of course, a larger country, you had a number of very, very viable newspapers in the larger cities and even in the smaller cities and states that covered the kind of news you're talking about. As the advertising model collapsed, these places went from, like the Oregonian where I worked, having 400 editorial employees to having 75. So wow. significant drop. And so what we were able to do is raise money nationally from some fairly wealthy donors, and then be able to say to some of these news organizations, look, we can pay for you to have a reporter to do investigative reporting. We'll give you a one-year salary. You propose the project because we're not going to tell you what to do. We don't know your area, but we will give you enormous amounts of support. Not only the salary of the reporter, but we'll give you legal support. We'll give you editing support. We'll help you with the quantitative journalism. So all of these things, sort of allow them to do amazing work. And some of them that we have done over the last several years have really been remarkable. I mean, we did a grant to a reporter in Alaska who looked at the issue of the failure to investigate sexual assaults by the police in Alaska. It's a very local story, but it turned out that essentially the police were ignoring rape. and it had a real impact in the state. Also, the federal government sent money to help. And so this is, something that, can really fit our model. And it's been surprising to us that it is easier to raise money sort of nationally. In other words, I don't know if this is true in Israel, but we have people who understand the value of local journalism. Even though they may live in Chicago, they'll give us money to help journalism in California or Florida or Tennessee. And that's been surprising. It's actually easier to raise the money from that person than it is to go to Tennessee and say, in Memphis, I want to raise $1 million to fund a local journalism website. That turns out to be harder.
That's actually quite surprising and interesting, yeah. But I mean, I think the central point you're making too is that these local stories that really are quite important that get overlooked because of the changing nature of the economic model of journalism. So ProPublica has done such remarkable work. I want to thank you for stewarding it so brilliantly, for sharing your time with us. And I turn it back over to you, Eyal and Alona. Thank you so much.